Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud, all stoned. This video, we're going to do part 2 of Little Blue Book number 1791, titled Freethought and Agnosticism, Lies and Confusion in Conventional Literature, written by Joseph McCabe. Now, conventional literature is 1943. That's when this was written. So it's copyright 1943. Not today's conventional literature, but it's probably the same. So here we go. Chapter 3, and this will be the final part. This is a smaller little book. Chapter 3, True Agnosticism is Rare. So far, I have been considering the advance of atheism in conjunction with communism and advanced socialism in the last 20 years. And I have therefore not mentioned America or Britain, where communism has made very little progress, and socialism is much too respectable to suffer the least entanglement with atheism. But in attempting to get a round estimate of the total number of atheists in the world in our time, we have to include these in our survey. Some readers may feel that I am becoming rather academic in this discussion of belief and unbelief. I would ask them to read again the first of this essay. It is just as practical as the others. The sole object it is to explain the alliance of the churches with reaction, which has had so much to do with the misery that has fallen upon the world and the insidious demand for a still closer alliance in the work of what is called the reconstruction of Europe, but might, as far as free discussion is concerned, be suspected to be a plan to spread the miserable ideas of Vicky, Madrid, Lisbon, and Rome over as much of Europe as is possible. In approaching the problem of religious revolt in America and Britain, there is a special difficulty on account of the innumerable shades of skepticism. Curiously enough, I have within the last hour had an amusing illustration of this. A knock takes me to the door, and a couple of women, the speaker a robust, angular, horn-rimmed, spectacled spinster, who ought to be doing something useful, opens. "Good morning. We bring you a message of hope, and if it's religion," I interject crudely, "you may keep it all for yourself." "It is not religion," she protests proudly, "but Christianity. Religion is a racket, but Christianity..." The door closed. So we now have Christianities, which are not religion, 100 Christianities, which are religion, 100 religions, which are not Christianity. But to the religious person, it doubtless seems that there is as great a diversity beyond the pale. Then it will be better to sort out the skeptics, infidels, unbelievers, freethinkers, humanists, atheists, rationalists, and agnostics before we go further. Most of these are missiles of the religious fight. An unbeliever, in Latin form infidel, freethinker, rationalist, which is a late word, or skeptic, was a man who rejected Christianity, but might or might not believe in a God. Most of the words are now usually applied to a man with no religious beliefs. In time, the sharp antitheist of deist and atheist were invented for those who rejected Christianity. But the word atheist was given a flavor something like pansy or sodomist, and respectable folk who had no belief in God looked for a new name. Rationalist was favored by intellectuals, and secularist or freethinker by others. The clergy managed to attach that tampering with another man's wife suspicion to each of them, and Huxley earned the immortal gratitude of respectable freethinkers by coining the word agnostic. By the end of the last century, freethinkers had been too numerous to be dismissed as village idiots or disguised burglars, so the clergy saved their face by pretending that agnostic was the same thing as reverent agnostic. and could be mentioned without more heat than when they speak of the important, impotent, or consumptive. A few tried the words positivist and humanist, but insisted that they were religious, with or without God. And the general public said that the words of said in the words of Dante's Guide, just take a look at them and pass on. Huxley defined positivism as Catholicism without Christianity. Humanism is rather like Protestantism without Christianity. The chief cause of confusion in classifying non-Christians today is the familiar distinction between agnosticism and atheism. In Britain, much the same thing as freethought and secularism. As a matter of fact, there ought to be no difficulty, as there is today no real difference. Huxley meant by agnostic the man who deliberately says that he does not know whether there is a God or not, because the human mind is from its nature incapable of dealing with such a problem. I'm not going to discuss his philosophy of the mind, which was rotten and is hardly shared by anybody today. Any mind of at least average capacity is capable of understanding every supposed argument for the existence of God. Huxley prided himself that his mind, a particularly lucid and gifted mind, dealt with far more formidable problems than that. This supposed incapacity to deal with problems beyond experience practically went out with Huxley and Spencer, who all his life studied problems beyond experience. I have met or corresponded with more freethinkers and agnostics than anybody, but I never met one who declined to study the evidences for the existence of God on the plea that the problem was beyond the capacity of his mind. Very large numbers of people in America and Britain, the word agnostic has not caught on elsewhere, now say that they are agnostics and not atheists because they do not deny that there is a God. It is only in this sense that they don't know. But that is exactly the position of the great majority of atheists. They have examined the so-called evidence and found it unsound. Many feel that the contention of a few atheists that the ugliness and disorder of nature disprove the existence of God are much more cognate than those of the theist. But a man does not usually feel called upon to deny the existence of something because he finds the supposed proof of its existence unfounded. A great deal of sham fighting would be avoided if free thinkers could take the trouble to consult the proper authorities. The best dictionaries of America and Britain, they will tell you that an atheist is a man who either denies or disbelieves the existence of God, and quote the best writers in support. If you have any doubt about the word disbelieve, you will find that they define it as well as not to believe or to be without a belief in. That is the simple position of 99% of the atheists and agnostics I know, or whose books I have read. When you turn to actual life instead of academic definitions, the real difficulty is different. It is that vast numbers of people do not know whether they believe in God or not. They never ask themselves the question and are confused if you ask it. Hence to the immense number of atheists of whom I have spoken. You must add many millions in America and the British Empire, but it would be rash to attempt a figure. In the case of Britain, we have some material. The churches themselves say that 4/5 of the people never go to church and are not Christians in any sense. But we have only very partial indications what they believe about God. The churches like to the churches like to assume that they do believe in God, but they would have the skin of any Gallup surveyor who went amongst them to find out. 1 or 2 newspaper probes have been tried, but not 1 in 20 of their readers took the time to respond, I think it is. Yep, to reply. You may find it significant that any of those who did reply, 4/5 were atheists. I've not got the same result. I have got the same result by persuading working people to inquire for me in their own circles. If you agree with me that the man or woman who is asked if he or she believes in God and has to think it over or mutter, I don't know, is an atheist, as much as the one who replies promptly in the negative, then at least half the non-churchgoers, some 32 million of Britons, are atheists. America is not nearly so wicked, according to the clergy. But you may be one of those malicious folk who think that on such a subject the clergy are prepared to do violence to their strong personal regard for veracity. They say, "You are aware, no doubt, that the religious statistics solemnly published by Washington are supplied by them, that nearly half the people of America are members of the churches. It is true that some clerical writers of not a little authority have written that the figures the clergy send to Washington are worth less than nothing. It is true that the large Catholic element of the statistics is, shall we say, misleading, because millions who think they have left the church are included, because the church assures them that they have not. It is true that American cities impress me on Sundays. I have spent 8 months in New York, 4 in Chicago, and 3 in Kansas City, and odd weeks or weekends in many others, as not so conspicuously more religious than London. That crime and graft are said to be not much scarcer in America than in England. That American novels, which I prefer to English, reflect a remarkable candor about sex and American pictures. Obviously, would if they were allowed that. But please yourself. Other countries have, as I have shown, something more than 220 million atheists or more than the world total of subjects of the Pope, whom the press and politicians treat with such reverence. Shall we say that the United States brings the figure up to 250 million? In that case, atheists are the largest body in the world, with an agreed principle in regard to religion. I'm not sure that we ought not to add 250 million Chinamen, in proportion to the total population, says Mr. Chai Sound Chung in the last issue of the official Chinese yearbook. The number of bona fide Buddhists, Taoists, Christians, and Confucianists has been and is comparatively small. And your daily newspaper and much more dignified oracles assure you that folk without any religion are scarce and must be ignored in the post-war reconstruction. But can you altogether blame them? When one of the foremost scientists of America writes in one of its most popular weeklies, "I never met a thoughtful man who does not believe in God." Curious that the set of ideas, religion, which are supposed to be the most effective in keeping people honorable and conscientious, inspire a more dishonorable and unscrupulous talk than even political ideas. Still true. That's the end of chapter 3. Now on to chapter 4, the final chapter. Atheism, the Law of Mental Development. In 2 large works, serially produced by the Heidelman Julius Company, the Joseph McCabe Magazine, A History of Atheism, and the Freethinkers Library, Study of Atheism, I have thoroughly expounded and proved the facts and ideas which have here to be stated very briefly. Most of my readers know that as a rule, there are years of laborious study, given at full length in earlier works, behind the most summary of my statements. And this is particularly true about my remarks on theism and atheism. I do not spare a leisure hour from work in a laboratory or divert my attention for a moment from the politics to tell the world the truth about religion. It is as big and exacting a subject as astronomy or biology, entailing prolonged research in history, science, philosophy, and contemporary life, as well as theology. But since I quit a chair of Catholic philosophy for atheism, I regret that I called it agnosticism, not having at that time any stimulus in my environment to look closely into this matter of atheism and agnosticism. 46 years ago, I have devoted a very large part of a very busy life to the subject. Since, in fact, I began my studies for the priesthood at the age of 16, I may say that religion, from one angle or another, has been my chief preoccupation for 60 years. And one of the most important conclusions that has been forced upon me in recent years is that it is a law of history that atheism increases with the growth of civilization. I've shown this in full detail and at great length in my History of Atheism, Joseph McCabe magazine, and added new evidence in a British publication, The Golden Age of History, the proper purpose of which is to rebut the frivolous charge that atheism leads to social decay by showing that civilization always reached its highest point in periods of skepticism. These are the only substantial works on the subject which have appeared in the last quarter of a century. But, of course, those censors of the public's reading, the press reviewers, entirely ignored them, and the oracles who are forever repeating the parrot cry that atheism leads to social chaos and decay have never heard of them. As there are probably many readers of these essays who are not likely to have read the earlier and larger works, I may give them an outline sketch. Incidentally, it will show them how easy it is, in principle, to make that serious study of the origin and social significance of atheism, which our historians, sociologists, and moralists refuse to make, instead of repeating the shallow conventional cry that atheism is a rare, superficial, and socially dangerous development. Pause for hydration. Hydrate, Maddie. Of the ancient world, by which I mean the course of civilization to the appearance of the Ionic Greeks in the 6th century BC, we have very little literary evidence except in the case of Egypt. The fragments of Babylonian literature, now remember this was written in 1943, are mostly temple stuff and business documents. Of Egyptian thought itself, we have not much trace until the golden age of the 14th century BC, which saw a notable growth of skepticism. But much earlier isolated documents, like the Maxims of Ptahhotep and the Song of the Harper, show that skepticism had appeared and spread with culture. Satisfactory literature begins, however, with the Greeks, or the blend of Greeks and Phoenicians, who built the great cities of the Mediterranean coast of Asia Minor, effected a remarkable advance of political life, art, science, and philosophy, and inspired the Athenians. From the first, their literature, though it survives mainly in fragments, indicates a general spread of skepticism in the middle class, and this skepticism remains the general attitude of the thinking minority, often spreading widely amongst the people to the fall, 8 centuries later, of the Greek-Roman civilization. A German philosopher has written a ponderous work to prove that there were very few atheists in Greece. He means clumsily men who said outright that the gods of the Greek people were figments. The fate of Socrates and other philosophers might have explained to him why that practice was rare. No one suggests that these Greek philosophers did believe in the Greek deities, and Plato alone tried to substitute a personal god for them. 9/10 of them were, as Zeller says, materialist, and philosophy was in those days not a piece of verbal embroidery that a select few appreciated. Philosophers were the leaders of cities and had very great influence. Every history of philosophy will tell you that the religious Plato had none of this wide influence, and the semi-religious Aristotle very little. Materialistic atheism was the common attitude of educated men in the greatest civilizations of ancient times. Since Confucianism and pure or original Buddhism are atheistic, the law is fully established in the case of Asia, as I have shown. In Europe, in the ensuing period, it holds good by way of contrast. From roundly 450 to 1050, there was no culture. And there was no civilization and no atheism. After 1050, the advance of culture and in many respects of civilization began again, and skepticism spread. But there is now the most ferocious religious tyranny of all time, and we do not look for many expressions of atheism in an age in which such open confession meant torture and death. Only in the Arab-Persian civilization of the time, about 800 to 1400, which was immensely superior to that of Christendom, was there a high and, for most of the time, free culture. Except in the periods and localities in which the fanatics got power, skepticism was general. A popular proverb divided men into two classes: those who have religion and no intelligence, and those who have intelligence and no religion. It is hardly necessary to refer to our own time. Civilization has reached its high water mark, but culture has risen incalculably higher than it ever did before. Decade by decade, atheism has grown with culture until, as I showed, it became, in the last quarter of the century, an extraordinarily rapid growth. Seeing that it spread among the mass of the people with the establishment of universal education, cheap literature, popular lecturing, and freedom of expression, and that it is most abundant in the highest region of culture and least abundant in the lowest region, the law I have formulated is fully vindicated. Dr. Millikan, who never met a thoughtful man who did not believe in God, attempted, in conjunction with the late Dr. H. F. Osborne, to get American men of science to sign for publication against the fundamentalists a profession of belief in God. They could not get 10 scientists of any distinction to sign it. And if Dr. Millikan did not know that 20 years before he published his statement about the views of American men of science, Professor Leuba had got from them a private confession that 70% of the greater men of science of America did not believe in God. We have merely another proof of the carelessness, or worse, of these important folk whose religious belief are hammered into the public mind by the press and the preachers. Incidentally, the apropos of the blank atheist and the reverent agnostic, the leading scientists who said no to the question, "Do you believe in God?" were twice as numerous as those who gave what is called the agnostic reply. In 1933, when Leuba inquired again, the atheists were 56%, the agnostics 14%, and the believers, including teachers in sectarian colleges other than Catholic, 30%. Atheism still grows, and most prolifically in the highest region of culture. I have two aims in writing this essay. One is to show the reader how foully he is misinformed on the subject of religion and atheism by the press, literature, and radio. Did you ever have them describe to you a situation even remotely like that which I have here shown to be the true situation? The whole of these agencies of public instruction are used to give you quite the contrary impression, that the vast majority of folk are religious, and the atheist is a crank, a fool, or a man with hyperthyroid sex glands. Ooh, hyperthyroidal sex glands. I did not see that one coming. The second aim is to explain the alliance of the churches with the powers which allowed the great disaster to fall upon us, and to prepare the reader for a more active intervention of that alliance when the war is over. Reasoning as scientific men, businessmen, and mathematicians do when they anticipate the future by projecting an actual curve beyond the present, we must see that if culture and popular education continue to increase, and there is complete freedom of discussion, religion is doomed in this or the next century. The normal development is to be checked by an alliance in their mutual interest of the clerical corporations and the commercial, industrial, financial, and political corporations. That's sad. It never happened. It went the other way, my dear friend. Okay, so that is the end of Little Blue Book number 1791, titled, as I get it together here, it is falling apart. The cover is already fallen off. Pages are falling out. Little Blue Book number 1791, titled Freethought and Agnosticism, Lies and Confusion in Conventional Literature, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1943. Thanks for listening, and join me in the next Little Blue Book.